I'm the Associate Director at UM Ventures, and I also am the office's representative on the Conflicts of Interest Committee. We also have Phil DeShong, who's a faculty member on campus, also has a company and is the chair of the COI committee, and Joe Smith, who's the COI administrator at the university. So first, let's talk about what is a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest arises when a person or entity involved in multiple interests, often financial, where serving one interest could mean working against the other. Situations where this sort of COI might arise at the university are where someone in the university community is put in a position to gain personal benefit or financial advantage arising from their university position. It could be through outside professional activities or through their actions or decisions at the university, which might involve research, administration, or educational activities. The university has a conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment policies, which hopefully you're familiar with. This applies to all personnel who work on campus, whether you're faculty or staff. Conflicts of interest involve potential financial gain or personal benefit to an individual employee or related people. Conflicts of commitment involve where certain activities might compromise your ability to fulfill your time commitment and basic job responsibilities to the university. Keep in mind too that as university employees, that we're also state employees. So Maryland state ethics laws also govern certain conflicts of interest situations. State ethics law says that an employee or official of the state might not intentionally use the prestige of your office for personal gain or for personal gain of someone else. An official or employee may not participate in official action where you have certain relatives also have an interest. An official or employee may not hold any employment relationship that would impair your impartiality or independence of judgment. You may not disclose or use for personal economic benefit confidential information that you get as part of your state position. Employee might not represent the state in a case, contract, where you've participated significantly, and you may not solicit gifts for yourselves or others under certain guidelines. But one nice thing about being at the university is that there's this research and development carve out from that state ethics law. So a present or formal state university employee may have a relationship that might otherwise be prohibited with an entity, a company engaged in research or development, if the educational institution has adopted policies and procedures and that person complies with those policies and procedures. So we have the COI and COC policies. And so as long as you comply with what the university's policies are, you're in line with state ethics law. The problem arises if you're not complying with the university policies, then that might kick in non-compliance of state ethics law. Keep in mind too, research and development includes the development of or marketing of university-owned technology, acquiring services of an official or employee by an entity for research and development purposes, or participating in a state economic development program. Again, there's certain benefits to allowing, if you're part of the university, also part of a company doing research and development, there's many benefits to that. And so there are certain state laws and regs that better outline what the exemptions are. So if you are involved in an activity that's creating new jobs in the state, you have a research and development company, you've licensed something from the university, it's going to bring in additional research funding. Those are the sorts of things that the state sees a benefit in. But again, in doing these things, in being allowed to be a director, official, or employee of a company that's involved with some business with the university, you still have to comply with the university's COI policies and procedures. So you can be, as a university employee, you can also be a director or officer in a company. Corporate positions as a director, that's someone, think of the board of directors of a company, you're involved in policy making for the entity, you direct the business path, you're identified in the articles of incorporation for the company, you might be elected by shareholders at annual meetings, and you could be an inside or outside director. A shareholder, just being a shareholder alone, is someone who has an ownership interest in the entity, but not necessarily involved in making decisions for the company. An officer of a company is involved in day-to-day operations and decisions of the company. Officers are usually appointed by a board of directors, and these are people like the CEO, COO, CFO, and secretary. Now, being a director or officer of a company comes with certain responsibilities to that company, and that's what's known as a fiduciary duty. And this, I think, is where a lot of conflicts arise, and people need to keep in mind what their fiduciary duties are, both to the company, if you're part of a company, and to the university as a university employee. So if you are an officer or director of a company, you owe this fiduciary duty to your company, and that includes a duty of loyalty, which means that you must set aside your personal interests and the university's interests and make decisions on the basis of the company's best interests. And you can't directly compete with the company. Generally, what's in the company's interest is to make money, earn a profit. Another fiduciary duty is the duty of care. So you have to be a fully informed, active participant in the company and make good faith decisions. And this means exercising good business judgment in the operation of a business. So something to think about is, how do you manage competing duties, especially conflicts of interest in research, where there's a potential for biased research results? And that's really the intent of our discussion today. And as we go on, again, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. More on the duty of loyalty. In a corporation, this requires putting the corporation's interests ahead of your own personal interests. You breach this duty where you do something like diverting corporate assets, opportunities, or you use information that you learn about in your position with the company for personal gain. It's generally okay, though, if an individual's decision benefits both the individual personally and the corporation. The breach occurs when the person puts his or her interest ahead of the company's. So consider if you are representing the company in transactions, doing transactions with the company, using company property or information, or doing something in competition with the company. As university personnel, I think you also have fiduciary duties to your employer. It's a different standard than as a corporate director or officer, but still you have a duty of loyalty, and that includes no direct competition with your employer during your employment. And this also includes compliance with university policies. Phil, do you want to talk more about your research COI chart?
So I think we've kind of overwhelmed you here in the beginning, most of you, if you look at this with the sort of technicalities of this. And I encourage you to spend some time looking at this and thinking about these carefully. And
we will share the slides as well.
Yeah, if a disclosure, so let's look at a COI disclosure. I should come back and stress a couple of things to you that Felicia has talked about so far, and that is oftentimes we're talking about faculty members or employees working between a company and the university. This serves as automatically, this is a conflict of interest, and I'll show you why with this little diagram. If you look at research on the campus, here's the standard way that this is called a primary relationship. And this is the way the Conflict of Interest Committee thinks about things. So you'll see in the next couple of slides how this works. Typically, research on this campus is done in the following manner. Some government or corporation or foundation gives money to the university to sponsor your research. And that, so when you get a grant from the National Science Foundation, it's not exactly to you, it's to the university to sponsor research in your lab. So the money is actually given to the university. And then from there, it goes to your lab, a faculty member, or some other research activity on the campus. This is considered a primary relationship. It's transparent, it's legal, there's no secondary reason for you to bias your research. It can be considered objective and it's monitored. There's specific rules for doing this. So conflicts of interest arise when you deviate from this primary relationship. So if you go to the next slide, Felicia. Yeah. So these are called secondary relationships. And so these secondary relationships are things like consulting or stock ownership. You have a family who's an owner, a family employee, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of ways that this happens with these secondary relationships. So if a corporation is giving you money or giving directly to a faculty member or to a faculty member's family member, this is not a transparent relationship because you don't actually formally disclose this in any way. And so it's not transparent. It's not readily monitored. So we don't know exactly what you're doing. And if you think about this, I just always give the example of, the Acme Corporation. If you consult for Acme, you can't take a grant from Acme because that would be a conflict of interest. You've got competing interests here. Primary relationship, you take a grant from Acme to look at wind turbines, okay, to invest turbine design. On the other hand, you're consulting for them at the same time. Well, let's see, will your consulting go away if you don't find that they're making great turbines, or will your grant go away because of this consulting? This is a primary secondary relationship that we can't have. So the university puts, again, this opportunity to have management plans to kind of cut this out. So if we look at the next slide, there are potential solutions to this. You can remove the conflict. And so on this campus, you aren't allowed to consult for a company who's giving you a contract. That's a policy on the campus. So that's the removal of the conflict. You can reduce it in some way. And again, we have to discuss that. Every situation is unique. We oftentimes monitor the research that goes on, and we require you to disclose it. So I have a company. That company commercializes my own lab's research. We've disclosed it. We've said what we do. We share that information with the university. And there's an oversight group who looks at what we do and make sure that we abide by our management plan. So that's a monitoring of our research. So this is the way you can avoid some conflicts of interest. And there are lots of different management plans, and we'll talk about some of this as we go through. So, you have to disclose it. It gets reviewed by us. We develop a management plan for you. And we want to know all the details, or we want to know at least the pertinent details. And oftentimes you're unclear as to what are the pertinent details. So that's the reason I would say the three of us are here today, because we want you to call us. Felicia, Joe, and I are always available to talk to you, to give you advice, to help you develop a management plan. The number of times that we've said, you can't do this to somebody is very slow. What we do say is, you can't do this in that way. You have to do it this way. We have to develop a management plan that allows us to abide by both federal and state law and the university's policies. Okay, so I'll let Felicia go back now.
Sure. We did get one question. It's, when you commercialize the IP from your lab through your company, are you still pursuing research on the same topic? Are future research results implicitly signed over to the company? So when that happens, if you generate IP at the university and the university owns it, then we will execute a license. We'll give permission then to the company to practice the university's IP. Generally, it's just existing IP that gets licensed. If you are continuing then research in the same area, then there's ways to establish things so that you can still pursue similar areas of research, but you just make sure you keep things separate, which helps avoid muddying the waters, and it helps manage your conflict. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but it's things like you don't do research on behalf of the company in your university lab, so you need a separate space. You keep people separate. The more separation between what you're doing at the university and what you're doing at the company, the more you can set up to keep things separate, the better things get managed.
Yeah,
And
I think that's an important point for you to recognize. This, how you, most of us do continue to do work on the research that we've done all along. So I still continue to work on making my technology better and better. I don't do it, I would do development work in the company. I do basic science in my lab. I make sure that those stay apart. The people who work in the company, they don't work in my lab. I don't have access to university facilities for the most part, except under a license agreement, which we can talk about. But again, it's all disclosed. There's a contract with the university. Everybody knows what's happening, and we have to abide by that.
And generally, we don't automatically promise improvements to that originally licensed IP to the company. If we do, it's under very strict monitored conditions, and everyone involved in the research has to sign off that they understand that the company might be getting an interest in it. But generally, that's not the case. Certainly, if something new arises or an improvement comes up that we think the company would benefit from, then we would perhaps try to amend the license to include that new IP or improvement IP and give rights to the company. Same thing if the company has improvements on the university's IP, if it's totally separate, could be counted as new IP, even though it adds some value to what you've licensed from the university, that is likely to stay the company's. So again, as Phil mentioned, report any potential or actual conflicts of interest. It gets reviewed and generally approved. What do you report? Real, potential, or even just apparent conflicts of interest. When in doubt, disclose it. Disclosure isn't a bad thing. It's not like you're admitting some guilt for something. You're just making sure you're complying with university policies. I think it's better to over-report than under-report. And how do you report? First, to your unit head. You do this annually. If you're doing certain, say if you're consulting, but that consulting might not directly be involved in your research, you certainly want to put that consulting activities in your outside professional activities report, and to the research compliance office for specific research projects.
So let me just say one more thing before we move on from this that Felicia said. I would encourage you, Joe and I and Felicia and Wendy and a few others, get paid to be of help to you. We do not get paid to be policemen to monitor your behavior. My job is to make your life easy, not to make it hard. So if you doubt for a moment whether you have a conflict of interest, contact us and let's walk through this process. It's often a very easy process. If you file a disclosure, guess what happens? You get a document that says, oh, you're conforming, or you don't have a conflict, or you do, and here's a management plan. And this protects you. This doesn't protect the university. This is protecting you. We've looked at your situation. We don't think there's a problem. Assuming that everything that you've told us is true, then you're protected. If somebody comes along later and says, oh, you should have done this. No, you needed to do this. You say, they looked at it. I'm safe, okay? This is a get out of jail free, assuming that you told the truth, okay? But so our job is to make your life easy, not to make it hard. So don't hesitate to contact us.
And the earlier the better. Certainly if you have a deadline for starting a project for the university accepting a contract or grant that involves a potential conflict, you want to make sure it's disclosed in advance, because the university won't expend funds until we've said there's no conflict or the conflict is managed. Joe, do you want to talk about the life cycle of a disclosure?
Sure. So what I'll do here is I'll mention, just so everyone's aware, there's different types of disclosures that need to happen periodically. So typically the Conflict of Interest Committee is reviewing your conflict of interest disclosure, which arises due to any of the circumstances that we just discussed. Now, to take a step away from that for a second, there's another type of disclosure, and that's a financial conflict of interest disclosure, which is a requirement at the time of proposal from certain funding agencies, primarily NIH and public health service funding agencies. And that process is different than the conflict of interest process. I'm not going to get into details about the process at the moment. However, timing is important. So for a financial conflict of interest disclosure, it's a requirement that you submit that at the time of proposal or shortly thereafter. Now, with that being said, we'll kind of just put that off to the side. Coming back to the normal conflict of interest, we'll call it normal, conflict of interest process. We encourage our investigators to submit their conflict of interest disclosure closer to the time of award. So once you have an idea that your project might be funded or that you're going to have a good score, that's the time to start getting signatures on your form and sending it into the COI office. So we can begin the pre-review process and try to have the COI management plan approval right around the time of your award, shortly before or shortly after. That way, your funds aren't tied up waiting for a COI review. And the reason we encourage that sort of timeline is really it comes down to administrative burden on the investigator side and the COI office and the COI committee. So if you submit a conflict of interest disclosure shortly after you submit a proposal and you have no idea that it'll be funded, you might find out in a few weeks or a few months that it's not funded. In the meantime, you've gone through this entire process of completing the disclosure, sending it off to your chair and dean for signatures, and then the COI committee's reviewed it, and maybe we've had a couple of rounds of modifications, and then poof, it doesn't happen at all. And we've kind of spent all these hours reviewing something that isn't going anywhere. So again, Phil has mentioned this, Felicia's mentioned this, let's reach out to us so we can sort of talk about where you are and kind of slot you in the right spot. So we're not doing too much work, and we're trying to line up as best we can with when the award might arrive. So essentially when you are ready to submit your COI disclosure, you'll draft it, discuss with your chair and your dean, well, department chair first, and then it'll go on to the dean for signature. As was mentioned earlier, if you want to talk to us about what looks good in a conflict of interest disclosure and management plan, feel free to send us a draft at coi@umd.edu, and we'll be happy to look at it and provide some pointers and maybe some common concerns that pop up. And you can do that before you send it for signatures. So once we do receive the final signed COI disclosure, we'll conduct a pre-review in the office to see if there's anything glaring that's missing, and then we'll assign it to the next available COI meeting agenda, which we have once a month. There have been occurrences where we've needed to do something urgent. We prefer not to do that, but if we need to, we can. And then once the COI disclosure and management plan have been approved by the committee after possibly another round of modifications between the PI and the committee, then the approval letter is then drafted. It goes to the vice president for research, for review, And then once she has approved, it's sent to the president's office for his approval. And then once we get the final approval, we'll notify you, the chair, the dean, any related co-investigators on the project, possible oversight officials, oversight committees, and we'll notify Aura as well, so they can set up an account or start releasing the funds for that particular project. Once the project is approved, our system of record is IRBNet, which we put the disclosure into, and that gives us all the dates and reminders and everything that gets sent out to you as an investigator. Your COI disclosure and management plan, once approved, will be approved for 1 year, and you'll receive reminders. I believe it's 60, 45, 30, and 15 days out from expiration. And so at that point, you'll submit your annual update to us to let us know that, hey, I've met with my oversight official, I've talked to people, everything's working well. Send it into us and we'll process it, acknowledge it, and you'll be good to go for the next year as well. We also want to know if the situation's ended. So if the conflict is over, the project is over, and this doesn't exist anymore, let us know. We'll add that to the file, close the file, we'll report it out to the COI committee, and we'll move on from there. So, so I think that pretty much covers everything from a high level look.
And so Joe mentioned the management plan. So often when there's a conflict, you can't totally remove the conflict, and that's okay. But the plan makes sure there's steps, processes in place to mitigate the conflict or manage it. And so the management plan is developed by you, the PI, in order to distance yourself with the conflict or conflicting roles that could give rise to concerns about bias, research bias, or certain influence resulting in personal gain. And so often this might be having an oversight official. So let's say you're a PI at the university and your lab is getting funded by a company in which you hold equity and you have stock in that company. So there might be another oversight official at the university who oversees financial matters, is an outlet for students and other people working on the project to go to. There might even be a whole committee, depending on the complexity of the conflict, that meets regularly with your lab group and reviews records to make sure that the conflict is being managed.
Yeah, I'll make just a couple of comments real quickly on that.
Sure.
And that is, so this is one of the points that people come back to if you need an oversight official. So we have various ways, you know, if it's a relatively minor conflict, it's easy. If it's take my own case, if, you know, I have a company, I also, you know, some of this money goes in and out through the company and stuff that I get. So I have an award from the NSF that allows a subaward to the company. So I have a conflict of interest. I have a management plan. Who can be an oversight official? The oversight official has to be a full professor and someone who knows something about your technology. That doesn't mean they have to be an expert in the field, but you know, you can't have somebody from the art department being the oversight official for your chemistry grant. Okay, so it's somebody who has to have some technical expertise, and they have to be at the full professor rank. That means, you know, unfortunately, you can't have an assistant professor doing this, because you potentially have the chance, if you have a higher rank than this person, to say, well, you know, they didn't treat me, I'm unhappy with their performance, and so their promotion is going to be bad or something like that. So you're going to need to look at this role pretty carefully. I think that's important for you to recognize.
And again, after the management plan is approved, then what happens? PIs and co-investigators are notified. Your DAS also gets notified too, so that if additional people are being added to the project and need to sign off on something, the department has responsibility for making sure those folks sign off on it. And the final record resides in our IRBnet and with the RCO office. Let's talk about some more COI examples. So there's partner family. This is where conflicts might arise from the intersection of personal relationships with an employee's responsibilities to the university. Conflicts can arise in purchasing too. So say you're in a position to make purchasing decisions that unfairly enrich yourself or those who you have a personal relationship with. Consultants or gifts. So when your responsibilities to the university conflict with your outside consulting or outside professional activities. Conflicts or potential conflicts can arise when a vested party provides a gift that might appear to bias your research. So an example with a gift, let's say you get an award from Acme to study research. This is a sponsored research agreement. It goes through Aura. But then on the side, they give you a $100,000 gift to your lab, even though there's no expectations about what the money should be used for. Is this okay? Well, this certainly is a conflict. There's both a perceived conflict and an actual conflict. Some more about gifts. Gifts are managed by the College Park Foundation or the System Foundation. Gifts can be restricted or unrestricted. So restricted gifts means that the donor provides the gift and the university says, we're going to use it for this specific purpose. So say CMNS receives $38 million to build a new building and support scholarships and professorships. That's what that money is dedicated and has to be used for. There can't be any benefit to the donor. So gifts, whoever's making the gift, there are certain tax benefits that they get from doing so, so there can't be anything in return. So say someone's giving you a gift, but then they expect that you disclose all your IP to them and that they get a free license. That makes it no longer a gift. There should be no expectations or strings like that associated with such a gift. Similar example to what we last saw, a faculty member receives an award from Acme to study widgets that are developed by Acme. So Acme donates separately 1,000 widgets to that person's lab. Is this okay? On its face, it seems like, well, you want to study them, you want to get the widgets. Well, the project is outlined in a research agreement that goes through Aura. It's clearly defined. But the widgets, if the company gives it as a gift, then they can't expect anything in return. And so if they're expecting you to report results back, that's no longer a gift. So this does constitute a conflict of interest. So how should you better handle this? Instead, document the widget transfer in the research agreement, where it should say, as part of this research, Acme is going to provide 1,000 widgets. There might not be an additional cost to it, but again, the company can't get some tax write-off, tax benefit, and call it a donation. It needs to be contemplated in the actual research agreement. Some partner family examples. So if there are married researchers, you're in the same department, report to the same chair, both are co-PIs, could be in the same department. One's a PI though, one's a program manager. This then is a supervisor-subordinate relationship. Could even be on different campuses, but collaborating. As PI, if you give a subaward to a partner or family member company, in that case, we would put in an oversight official or committee. Similarly with purchasing, if you your brother has a company and they're the only ones that make a certain piece of equipment that you need for your research, on its face, this is a conflict since you're purchasing from a family member's company. So you need to go through the sole source justification, explain why this is the one company you can purchase from. So again, there has to be adequate justification through procurement to justify that sort of purchase. A PI and family example, say the PI wants to hire his or her adult child to perform a specific task like web design. In this case, we would want to see the adult child reporting to a supervisor other than the parent, and compensation has to be fair market and reasonable. So in management plans, in most cases, you're going to recuse yourself from discussions related to the other person's performance, where you have that relationship. Everybody else involved in the research needs to be informed of what the relationship is and sign off on that acknowledgement. And then if there's any concerns, then people are referred to the chair or director of graduate studies for grad students. Another purchasing example, Dr. Lee wishes to purchase equipment that's manufactured by LaserVision. Dr. Lee's sister is the CFO of LaserVision. Can Dr. Lee purchase the equipment from LaserVision? Potentially, with sufficient justification. What if the company's CFO is not related to Dr. Lee, but instead is the daughter of his department chair? I think that's potentially problematic too. But there are ways, I think, to manage it and make sure it's a transparent transaction. Consulting. A project requires the expertise of an outside graphic designer. This would be a consulting contract that goes through procurement. Let's say Dr. Kelly has a project, Dr. Kelly's spouse is a graphic designer. Can Dr. Kelly hire his or her spouse? Potentially, but again, the relationship has to be disclosed. You have to give sufficient justification as to why this is the graphic designer who can accomplish this project. I think similarly, if the person is also in a relationship to someone who's your Dr. Kelly's supervisor, I think similarly that needs to be disclosed and justified. Hiring a consultant. Let's say Dr. Jones is consulting with Acme. Acme, this company, gets a MIPS grant. These are awards, if you're not familiar with them, that are administered through MTech, and it's to encourage industry university collaborations in the state. So if you're a small company, the small company puts in $10,000, the state puts in $90,000. If you're a large company, it's a 50-50 split. So let's say Dr. Jones is consulting with Acme. Acme gets a MIPS award. Part of that work is to be conducted at the university with Dr. Smith, who's university faculty, as a PI in a joint project. Dr. Smith wants to hire Dr. Jones as a UMD postdoc on the Acme grant. So Jones consults with Acme, is also a university postdoc. Is this okay? Dr. Jones can't be both at the same time for the same project. So the management plan, if this is something you disclose to the committee, then we'll come back with saying, well, Dr. Jones can either be a university postdoc or Acme consultant, but not both.
You can see why this is immediately, if you think about this for a second, you see why this is a conflict of interest. Because if you say, well, I'm going to pay 50% of this person's salary on university funds and 50% of the salary on company funds, you know, how is that possible? Because he's in the lab, he's transferring all these things, or she's there all the time. Who does she work for? Does she work for the company, or does she work for the university? And the university is very concerned about that. You know, it doesn't look like they're. I mean, this is a conflict because you cannot define who the employer is, and the university is particularly concerned because as a state university, it's not supposed to show bias towards individual companies. Why don't you show that same for GE or Pfizer or whoever? So they're very concerned about that. That's the reason there's a policy about this.
But you know, we want companies who collaborate with the university who might have university employees to get MIPS funding. We want them to hire students and postdocs ultimately. There's a lot of benefits to all these sorts of activities. And so with entrepreneurship, certainly as researchers, you have expertise to solve real world industry problems. It's good for the university if a company then licenses university research results, gives students additional opportunities, and ultimate goal of the state is economic development, new company creation, creation of jobs, and having an avenue to develop basic research that's done at the university. But again, there's competing goals, and that's what we're trying to balance. And so to balance the university's research interests with those of the company and your personal financial goals, as researchers, you shouldn't do things like negotiate directly with the university on behalf of the company. How do you get around this though? So have outside counsel for your company or another corporate officer handle the negotiations. And this could be the negotiation of a license from my office for university IP. It could be a facilities use license if your company is applying to get space on campus. You, as a university person, cannot do the negotiation against the university because, again, who's your master? Are you serving the university's interests, or are you serving the company's interests, or your own personal interests? Also, as researchers, you shouldn't use university resources or facilities for company purposes. How do you get around this? Do the company work off campus. I think that's the cleanest. If, though, there's certain equipment on campus or space that you'd really benefit from having, then apply for a facilities use license. It's an application process. It is a multi-step routing, but again, there's lots of factors the university needs to consider in letting a private company use its equipment, space, and people. Again, as a researcher, you shouldn't use your students or your lab personnel for company activities. The solution is to, if there's a collaborative research happening, you want to ensure different reporting lines.
So I will point out that this is one area that the committee this is item number 1 on the priority list for the university's conflict of interest committee, is what are you using university students? So we protect the rights of university students and postdocs because they're the most vulnerable on the campus to abuse. So you cannot use your students in your company. You cannot, you cannot bring your company people in and do things in your laboratories without a specific agreement. But there's a section on your disclosure which talks about students. Are students going to be involved in this work and in what capacity? And you should answer that question very carefully. You should take some time. This is not a bureaucratic thing where, hey, they just, write whatever I want to write down there. You're going to get questions. And if you look back at that flow chart, it often says this is an iterative process where the committee comes back to you and asks questions. If the committee believes that you haven't disclosed fully or adequately, they're going to come back and ask you to answer specific questions. And you don't want this coming back to you multiple times, because then the committee's, one, it eats up your time, but the committee's going to start asking some serious questions about your general veracity if we have to extract information from you. So I think, again, come back, talk to us. We'll say, hey, you really need to address this point. You want to talk about this. What are the details here? Put that in. But protection of students is item number 1 on the committee's list.
And while it's a great thing for students to have real-world company experience, if you want to hire students at your companies because it's good for them and your company benefits, I think ways to do that properly, either wait till they graduate to hire them at the company, or if you're not advising them in a year or a summer, then they could work that portion perhaps for your company. But again, disclose the situation, let the committee know what you want to do, and we can help figure out the best way of making that happen. Let's see, I think we still have time to do a little bit more discussion. Here's an example. Dr. Linda Page receives recently disclosed new IP generated from her university research on cybersecurity. She wants to use this IP as the basis for a new startup company called Schmoogle. Schmoogle wants to license the IP, further develop it, and bring it to market. Schmoogle seeks an SBIR or STTR award, which encourages bringing this IP to market. Schmoogle then wants to subcontract its award, part of the award work, to the university. Dr. Page is really excited, has asked her department administrator to route the subaward paperwork through the university. Dr. Page is named as the UMD PI on the sub. She's also the authorized signatory on behalf of the company on the sub. The budget includes students and staff that work under her supervision, and the work will be performed in her new high-tech lab on campus. Dr. Page also mentions to her DAS that the award has to be signed today in order to proceed without issues. Does this present any actual or potential conflicts of interest? Hopefully you've recognized that yes, it does. What are the next steps? Can the faculty member appear biased? Certainly. Can the faculty member sign both the sub and be the PI on the sub? No. There needs to be a separate PI at the university from that at the company. Are there issues with using Dr. Page's own university lab? Yes. If that needs to happen, then the company needs to apply for a facilities use license to use the lab. There has to be, say, a definition of what time company work will be done as separated from university work. Needs to be separation of people, things like that. Using university students or staff, that's problematic as well. It needs to be managed. Purchasing of equipment or services from the company. The faculty member, the PI, would be purchasing from her own company. That has potential problems as well. Deciding the budget and expenditures, research results, all of these, I think, rife for potential conflicts, but can certainly be managed. And so in thinking about how to manage it, what are the company's interests? What are the university's interests? Also recognize Dr. Page has individual interests, and do all these interests align? Sometimes they might. I think the overarching interest is you want to see this IP developed, get put out there for a product. But how that happens and what then each party's underlying interests are might not align, and that could be where problems arise. So keep in mind, in each role, you might wear very different hats. So again, disclose. When in doubt, disclose. How it's managed, that we'll try to put a firewall up. I think that's the cleanest way if there is a conflict. Be mindful of using the university's identity, university space, procurement practices, IP, and protection of students. Very quickly, also wanted to mention that there's another type of conflict of interest that's the university's own conflict. This is institutional conflict of interest. This could arise in situations where the university, we take equity in a startup company that licenses our IP. So then the university has its own competing interests. And all of this has to be managed when university officials, those who control funds and resources, when they're making certain decisions that might benefit an outside company. All of these could lead to institutional conflicts of interest. We do have an Icoi policy. There's a committee that reviews ICOIs. And again, just like with individual COIs, management plans are put in place. What if conflicts aren't disclosed and managed? Here's some headlines where people didn't disclose, crossed the line, and might have even committed fraud, misuse of funds. So you don't want to be one of these headlines. The university certainly doesn't want you or us to be in any of these headlines either. And again, Joe mentioned COI at umd.edu for questions, submitting disclosure forms. And I think we do have a few minutes. I think people can unmute if you want to ask questions, or feel free to type additional questions in the chat.
Yes, since this is a Zoom meeting, please feel free to unmute yourself. You have that power.
And we'll share these slides also so you can review them in more detail. Here's references to the different policies and guidelines as well.
Any questions?
Geez, I feel like I'm back in class.
Well, if there are any more, if there are not no questions, I don't know if Joe or Phil, if you have anything else to add at the end, and we can close the session.
I have one quick question.
Okay,
Sure.
Hi. Is it like as researchers sometimes we do like become like editors or associate editors for some of the journals out there which requires your professional expertise, and in those times, like although you're not financially gaining anything from it, it still looks good on your CV, or like sometimes like you might be bigger in your network and that kind of stuff. So I was just wondering, does it also become like a conflict of interest, like serving as a senior editor on a journal and be a researcher at the university?
No, this is really not one of those things where you're going to see things. So if you start thinking of, most people don't think about conflicts of interest properly, but everything you do is in principle a conflict of interest. You're trying to make yourself better. But serving as an editor in a journal is not a conflict of interest. You are the benefit you're going to get. It's like a consulting job. It's, you know, before you take that editorship, that's a conflict of commitment, and you should have a conversation with your chair to make sure that your duties as the editor are not going to overwhelm your duties to be in your department, and so your chair I usually encourage people to speak with their chair because it's a conflict of commitment. So conflicts of interest would be much more like you have a company, and if you turn around and give a subaward from your grant to your company, that becomes your conflict of interest, because if the company benefits, you benefit. But just being an editor is more of a conflict of commitment than a conflict of interest. And you start by talking to your chair or unit head, and then they usually say, "Oh yeah, that's fine. We don't have." I've never heard anybody say, "Oh no, don't do that." Right?
I think that is still something generally you do have to report on your OPA or FAR,
right,
or whatever it's called. But
OPA.
Also, as a reviewer, if you are given something to review where you know the person, right, a personal conflict might arise, and I would talk then to the journal about what their policies are there, and you might need to recuse yourself from certain reviews.
Right. If a friend writes a paper and somebody really closely, I don't referee. There are 4 or 5 people I just will never referee their papers, even if I'm sent them, because I'm a close personal friend and I can't be unbiased. So they deserve that. But as a rule, no, being an editor is not a conflict of interest. It's a conflict of commitment, and you need to talk to your chair about that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I'm just emailing the slides out now to those who had registered.
I'll just add a quick 2 cents if just with regard to questions, even if you're not sure if it's 100% related to conflict of interest, send it to COI at UMD and we'll get you pointed in the right direction. We have a bevy of resources between folks on the committee and on the COI committee and the ICOI committee, and we'll definitely be able to get you pointed in the right direction.
Yeah, I reiterate what I said before. Joe's 100% right. We'd rather have you call us or contact us and we'll say, "Oh, no, you need to talk to so-and-so." We're happy to do that. That's what we get paid to do that, okay? You contact us and we'll send you in the right direction if we can. We'd rather have you do that than have you do a whole bunch of work and then find out, uh-oh, I need to do this instead. right? So we're happy to do that.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joe, Felicia, and Phil. And thank you to those who joined and stuck to the end with us. I know a few people probably had to go, and thanks a lot. We'll follow up with, I think Felicia, you said you already sent the slides. If you didn't receive the slides, let me know. And we will also post the video of this workshop on our YouTube channel, so you can rewatch this and contact us with any questions. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Bye.
Right. Thank you.